It's my privilege to moderate this afternoon's discussion. I think to help orient us, we will again have some initial intervention, speaking to what the report says about the subject that we're about to address. And thank you very much for those initial comments. Were you going to lead us off? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Jesko Henschel. I guess I was the deputy director of the report since we have disbanded or are disbanding. This is kind of our final get-together, and also for me, it's wonderful to be here, and we're deeply, deeply grateful that you all are thinking about something we've been doing and thinking about for a year. Quick comments. So we're going into the second part of the report, Good Jobs for Development, and I wanted to start up with a couple of links to the earlier panel discussions which we've had. As Martin had pointed out, we did use what the kind of the world is agreeing on in terms of a rights basis, of a human rights approach, but that is actually very clearly defined on the report. These are really unacceptable jobs, and it's relatively specific and also relatively narrow. In terms of bonded labor, involuntary labor, slave labor, harmful child labor. So not all types of child work, but harmful child labor, as well as discriminatory labor and those instances where collective bargaining is really repressed. Now, those are for us not jobs, and we actually go into using a lot of ILO data quantifying that. But that for us is really the floor. And to a certain degree, the concept we then introduce as good jobs for development is something which we feel is quite complementary to the decent work agenda. And that was mentioned, Joe Stiglitz mentioned it in the morning, and the panel picked that up as well. So the decent work agenda is an aspirational agenda. It's a normative agenda. It can be measured individually, and there are decent work indexes now in many countries, as well as at societal levels, but it derives from an individual welfare basis. So it has normative aspects of what is decent income, social protection provision in it, the core labor standards, and also collective bargaining. And in our emphasis, we don't go as far as to the normative of the individual, but our emphasis is on what came up earlier, this difference between the social value and the individual value of jobs. So Jan, when you talked about there are never enough good jobs for good jobs, that's correct. Our question is, well, what about these good jobs for development that have this spillover? And as Martin pointed out in the morning, what we found when we thought through it, these spillovers are actually very important. Bringing women into the labor force, reducing poverty, thinking about the pattern of job creation, bringing out agglomeration in functional cities, identity. And what I would like to ask the panel, if I may, that concept of good jobs for development, rather than the decent work agenda, which, again, it goes in a different direction, to what degree do you think that is something which can bring us forward in thinking through public policies and dialogues, and also in analysis? And then in terms of analysis, if that is a concept which you find interesting, where would you put the analytical emphasis, so to speak? The second chapter then goes into typologies, and Martin had talked about everything from agrarian to conflict environments with the same angle. In these jobs challenges, not what are good jobs, but what are good jobs for development that have that additional payoff for bringing society together, for example, by supporting the social fabric in post-conflict situations, or by reducing poverty in agrarian societies through increasing productivity for smallholder farming. So my question, if I may, to the panel, again, that different angle, rather than Latin America versus South Asia versus Europe, that angle with that typology, to what degree do you think, from your point of view, does that help us in reshaping the jobs debate? And I'll hand over to Sam for one more comment.
Just very briefly, my name is Samuel Freire Rodriguez, but everybody calls me Sam, as Jesko just did. So Perhaps you have noticed in the World Development Report, after every chapter, we pose what we have called difficult questions. And I think that having this panel and this great audience addressing those difficult questions, I think, is the most important part of our discussion. So when Jessica talked about spillovers, the spillovers is perhaps one of the gluing parts of the whole report. We pose the following difficult question, which is associated to our understanding of education and building of human capital as having very important social spillovers. But we pose the question, well, what if instead of building first human capital and then having the jobs, what if you need to have the jobs first in order to induce to human capital? What do you think about this? Perhaps we should pose policy recommendations in terms of find the jobs first because this will create these skills or will induce people to invest in skills. This necessarily, the idea of spillovers and in general, I mean, market failures of externalities drives to the idea of a social welfare function. And when you incorporate the idea of a social welfare function, you cannot have a global social welfare function. I mean, the social welfare functions are based on the nations, what the nations face as their main challenge and their preferences. So it's very country-specific or region-specific. And that's why we had to take the natural step of having all these classification of country types or region types or job challenges types. Somehow forgetting a little bit the idea of classifying countries by income per capita, but classifying them by institutions, by level of development, by geography or demography. But then the natural question is, okay, if you are going to favor certain types of jobs because those are the ones that you are challenged to create, should you have specific policies? Should you have a targeted investment climate? Should you have a specific policy for helping certain type of jobs? Usually the consensus view is no, you should have a playing level field and you shouldn't have a specific industrial policy. It's a kind of a veto word in the World Bank. But perhaps you should try to focus not on certain industries but on certain types of jobs for women, for small firms. This is not the same as industrial policy, but it's some form of targeting. Is this right, or is this just disguised industrial policy? It's another way of not having a level playing field. But then the next step was yes. Even though it's very country-specific or region-specific or nation-specific, there is a global agenda, which is driven by migration of people and migration of jobs. And this raises very important issues of perhaps having externalities or global public goods that require an understanding of these spillovers, not at a region or country level, but at a global level. And then the big question is, and it's a general concern, but perhaps even more in developed countries, is there a global competition for jobs? Are the jobs going elsewhere? And when going jobs elsewhere is fair or is not fair? What is accepted in terms of migration of jobs and what is not accepted? We have international agreements in terms of trade of goods, but we don't have very clear agreements on terms of mobility of jobs and people. So should we have some, is there a global competition for jobs? When is valid that jobs move to a certain country and when is not valid? Those are our difficult questions. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope the panel and the audience discuss them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a wonderful challenge to this panel to address these questions as you think about the dimensions that each of you have engaged on so deeply. We have a remarkable panel of 4 scholars, all of whom really are experts, and 2 of whom have been actively associated with major international organizations, and the others who have worked extensively as advisors to both domestic and international organizations. So I think we have remarkable expertise. You have their bios, so I will not further introduce them, and if I may ask that each speak in the order in which they are here, starting first with Dr. Commander. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Great, thank you very much. Well, being on the Upper West Side, discussing an excellent report, lots of good issues, in a conference organized by Jan and Ravi and with many friends, I think I know that I have a good job. So on a smug note, to hell with the rest of the world, I'm pretty happy. thank you for the invitation, is a way of saying it. So I was asked to talk about what is, I think, Chapter 6, diverse jobs, but I'm going to stray, and in common with many of the other speakers, so I don't think I'm committing any original sin here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that both the previous people have mentioned about the types of jobs that gets created and the sort of barriers to the creation of the objectives that we consider to be important. So I've started off by praising the report, and I think that's absolutely right. And I basically quite like the way they've driven home the heterogeneity across institutions, countries, initial conditions, outcomes. And in this particular chapter, they've picked, which I think Martin put up earlier in the day, to draw out a typology of types of countries: conflict, agrarian, urbanizing, formalizing, and so on and so on. Some of them are overlapping. I don't think they claim that they were neat, tight compartments, but I think they're perfectly reasonable organizing principles. But as you'll see, what I'm going to try and do is make it even simpler still, which may in the end, I suppose, possibly confound you, but let's see about it. So in all of this heterogeneity, essentially the report says that there are really basically four big desired policy outcomes that just about everywhere ought to be shooting for. One is high employment and labour force participation. Second is the share of so-called good jobs. We can come back to that. We've discussed that. And the third, which is in a sense a subcomponent, is we should have reallocation. We should have some sort of churning, both in workers and in jobs, and in effective routing of people from lower productivity jobs to higher productivity jobs. That seems to be the menu for the good world, for nirvana. But getting there, as they rightly point out, and I'm going to come back to, there's no unique model. And, living in the UK, being from there, I can see that clearly we have extremely different models, which Andreas will, I'm sure, talk about, in Europe at the moment. Very different combinations of the level of N, types of N, Germany, Denmark versus UK, Spain, and the like, different levels of and degrees of reallocation, and very different levels of unemployment. So the UK has about 7-8%. Spain, as we've said, has notionally in excess of 20%. And one point that I would make out of all of this, and dropping out of that, is actually something that I think is neglected in the report. I don't necessarily blame them for that. It's too hard. It's very hard to do, but it's really the role of political economy, and I'll come back to that and center my comments on that. Now, if I wanted to try and recombine all these different bits of their typology, agrarian and the like, back into something much more stylized and simple, I think actually it wouldn't be too difficult. We'd go back, and if I could do a diagram in PowerPoint, which is beyond me, I'm afraid, I would have done it that way. But we'd go back to some sort of two-sector model with segmented labour markets. You'd have sector one, call it, privilege, covered, formal, whatever you like, monitoring costs, efficiency wages, grosso modo, good jobs, at least as measured in terms of employment outcomes and wages. And in the other sector, wages set competitively and a more than, a significant share of so-called bad jobs. And then actually, if you look over time, and this is what I would say, there are more similarities than actually heterogeneity, in fact. On this skeletal structure, I think you can overlay sort of 3 or 4 important things of an institutional and other nature. One is employment legislation, protection for the most part, which normally covers so-called sector one. The second, in varying degrees, is wage regulation, minimum wages and the like, but there can also be other sort of tariff-setting rules. And the third are basically the odds and sods, or the bits of social insurance, which tend to be pensions, single-pillar type stuff for the most part, and in some cases a bit of UI, unemployment insurance. Now, if I look across countries, I mean, and this by and large is not true for the lowest income countries, but once you get off that low income floor, essentially these are all increasing in the income level. And most emerging markets, by which I refer to in my parlance as largely middle-income countries, have a lot of A, employment protection, some B, but instead of C, they tend to have severance. And that is, as we shall see, generally a pretty poor way of dealing with risk. And unemployment, although I go back, and one of the ladies, Kathleen, at the end of the last session said unemployment isn't relevant to most developing countries. I'm actually not sure that that's really true. I think unemployment is increasingly relevant, whether in a strict measurement sense, but much more importantly in a psychological and therefore ultimately in a political economy sense as well. So unemployment tends to result if, say, minimum wages are higher than the competitive wage, or unemployment insurance is too high and you get sort of incentive and other effects. Now, when you're doing such a big picture report, as Martin and his team have done, you clearly have to organize, and they've chosen a particular path, at least for this chapter. And you also have to cut out a lot of stuff. And I think, in a way, what I think they have cut out, but I would actually argue is pretty much the key question, or one of the key questions, is how do you actually reform these sort of dual labor markets? And by the way, dual labor markets can exist perfectly well in France and Spain with lots of temporary workers, temporary contracts and the like, as we know, just as much as they can exist in Egypt or in India. But thinking more about the sort of Indias, Egypts, Chinas of this world, my key question is, how do you shift out of this sort of segmentation? And I'm going to make an argument here, which I'm not going to try and empirically bolster, but because I think there probably is a lot of, well, I don't have time for a start. Now, the principal barrier, it seems to me, is actually the power of insiders, in other words, the so-called covered sector. And if anything, Danny Roderick did some nice work on this, lots of other pieces of information using the World Values Survey and the like. I think actually the growth in trade, so-called globalization, volatility, if anything, has raised risk aversion among workers. And going to Ragi's point from the earlier session, maybe if you've had a lot of protection for a long time, in a sense you endogenize it, and then you don't want to really put up with anything very much. And the second is the likely loss of wage premia. In other words, when you pull down some barriers, you sort of reduce the protection that people have, that's clearly going to cut into what they get paid. And the third, which is quite often extremely important, is that when you have a lot of employment protection, and often protection accompanying that in the product market, you get lots of inefficiencies. And when you get lots of inefficiencies, a liberalization inevitably leads to restructuring. And when restructuring probabilities are high, you're going to have clearly an increased risk of losing your job or high unemployment and the like. And I would argue that inside opposition generally kills reform without compensatory measures. Now, compensation can be taken too far, can be badly designed, and in many cases has been, and certainly the advanced countries, the OECD countries, offer many examples of how not to do it. But I'd like to say, because this is something that I've been working on and I think is pretty much a key issue for places like China, Brazil, or India, it's what combinations of policies can limit the power of insiders and incidentally also raise formality. And I would say that they're likely to include two things. One, the so-called carrots, the fallbacks, a bit of unemployment insurance that addresses risk and aids labour market reallocation. The second, in a sense, is the stick, which is curtailing employment protection legislation and limiting wage regulation. And, by the way, maintaining employment protection legislation while at the same time as introducing some other forms of social insurance is pretty disastrous and certainly to be avoided. And we know that they're very different models, China, as I put up, as against Eastern Europe, and so on. But how do you get down to it? And these are the sort of practical issues that some of the people that we work with, and certainly something that I'm working on a lot right now, is, so if you're a governor of a Chinese province, and you want to think, for a variety of reasons, including of a political, social nature, about how to mitigate risk, how do you actually design these fallbacks? Well, clearly there are sort of three margins you've got to work at. One is the incentive issues. Bentley McLeod mentioned that. Second is what it costs, the fiscal burden. And the third is institutional capacity. Can your institutions support this sort of edifice? Now, to summarize lots of complicated arguments and complex arguments relatively simply, my argument is that social insurance in these types of emerging market middle-income countries probably will need ultimately to be flat or tapered rate benefits, time-bound, probably relatively short-bound, 6-9 months sort of thing, and funded, I'm afraid, at least at this stage, at early stage, by contributions rather than, say, through layoff taxes. And clearly, generosity of what you pay will affect the speed of restructuring, but depending on how generous it is and how much it costs, it will also affect job creation and the path of you. So these are margins that you have to work at. And underlying that, which is, to go back to one of the, I think, very compelling themes that Martin and his team have put up, is that actually if a society is wanting to move to some form of social insurance, you really have to have the sort of political, moral support for it. By the way, in the UK, I think we see right now, as funding is coming from general taxation funding for our welfare system, more and more disconnected from contributions, the support among the general population is falling away very rapidly. So unless you have those sort of things aligned, I think, all of this is going to be a dog that doesn't run. Payroll tax is probably institutionally more feasible, although people like Blanchard and the others have, I think, and some of US experience quite rightly shows that layoff taxes, experience rating and the like is probably better in design terms, but I don't really think is going to work in most of these places for institutional reasons. And the last bit, what do you do about sector two, as it were, the informal economy? Well, there I think a bit of what the World Bank has been pushing, or bits of the World Bank have been pushing, so-called savings accounts, which is an old idea of Martin Feldstein, which never took off in this country, but has taken off, by the way, in Austria, which is where Andreas comes from, so maybe you can say something about it. But I think savings accounts really aren't going to work in most of these places for a variety of reasons. And it's no accident they haven't been taken up in many OECD countries. But I think in the case of the informal economy, there is a room for savings accounts plus top-ups, either from government and or employers at the start, and then ultimately over time folding it into the contributory scheme over time. So I think there is something there. The design and the implementation is pretty key. Now, the last thing, and then I'll wrap up. I hope I'm not going on too long. I probably am. Which was the point that the last speaker had. Policy. Look, I think the reality is there are an enormous number of policy levers that can affect the supply of jobs, the types of jobs and the like. And actually, in a country like the UK, where in many respects I think we do quite well, we do very badly in terms of the quality of jobs. And there the challenge is not really to make great wholesale leaps in policy, but to bring in new sort of incremental steps in policy that aren't either in conflict with what we have, but also take it in the right direction. Now, in the report, they're basically saying, which is, I suppose, in line with the general doxology these days, is that so-called horizontal policies, i.e. sort of good improving the business environment and the like, framework policies, these are pretty much acceptable. Most people do them, and so on. But the key question really is, what about vertical policy, targeted policy? And here, a few years ago, I used to edit the EBRD's transition report, 5 or 6 years. It's similar to the WDR, but less scope. And we did a piece on industrial policy. It was extremely interesting. And out of it came, I think, to draw the conclusions together. There's no problem finding analytical reasons for why you might want to have a vertical policy, particularly if a country wants to move from, say, being a natural resource economy with all the skills that implies to being something more diversified with a different set of skills. The problem that Ricardo Hausmann and the like talked about. He has a nice metaphor in a sense. If you have a production space, which is a bunch of trees, and you want to jump from one tree to the other, it's fine if your production is connected, your production space is integrated, but if the trees are all far apart, even if you're a very agile monkey, you can't jump to the next tree. And I fear, however, that the insight of an analytical nature trips up against the uncomfortable realities of policy and the like. And recently, we did a large piece of work on Russia, where the Russians, perhaps, took Justin Lin's advice. They went out. They thought they were going to copy Singapore, Israel, all sorts of dimensions. Well, I can assure you they are on the road to messing it up big time, because they copied what they wanted, and they basically used other levers of a largely ineffectual nature to try and drive the creation of innovative sectors, so-called good jobs and the like. The harvest will be extremely small. Lastly, I want to come back to something which I think is a nice irony out of all of this work. If we look in Europe, I mentioned the UK. We have a pretty good performance in terms of employment, high employment rate, rising even in the recession, relatively low unemployment. But we have a lousy set of outcomes in terms of skills and job quality. 20% of jobs right now are low end, in other words, below 2/3 of median wage, and that is, if anything, tending to grow. And yet, if we look at the UK, no hiring, very few firing restrictions, other sorts of things, it looks like the sort of textbook economy that the simplicity or simple-mindedness, you might say, of doing business would have held up as the model. And yet, in point of fact, what we have to do now, at least in policy terms, in the UK, is try and think how we get from relatively high employment to a different mix in the terms of employment. And all I can say, because I don't have the time, can come back to in the discussion, is that is proving a damn sight more difficult in terms of effecting marginal changes in policy than anyone might have predicted. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Right. I failed to clarify that our goal is to have 10 minutes or so of interventions by our initial panelists before opening it up for a brief discussion amongst us, and then, of course, questions from the audience. And if I could invite Professor Fields from Cornell University to speak next, please.
So this is my one and only one slide, and this is the cover of a book I published at the beginning of this year, and I had not had the benefit of any of the input from the WDR report when I did that book. I'll come back to this in just a minute. So I will add my words to those of others who said that this report was really helpful and informative. Now, my criterion, as I said to some of the team members at the time, was, is this something I would like to use in class? And so the answer is yes, it is. And Martin, if you would be so kind as to send 200 copies of the overview, I am making a public request so that I can use it in class next semester. Thank you. Okay. Now we've heard some interesting and challenging questions to this panel and to the other panels. So questions like, is labor a factor of production? Well, yes and no. Of course, workers are inputs into productive processes, but workers are also the object of the exercise. And what I want to show you are the faces of 4 workers in the developing world. Now, long ago, once I started working on developing countries, I talked to working people. But in 2003, my friend and colleague Ravi Kalmberg contacted me, and he said, a group of us from Cornell and WeGo, in the person of Marty Chen, and SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, are organizing a group of people to go and live with working people and their families in India. And would you like to go along? And I did that, and it was a phenomenal experience. It was such a phenomenal experience that the group decided that we would move on to South Africa and Mexico, and then go back to India, and then go back to South Africa and meet with our hosts again. So as we're formulating these policies, what I have found helpful, and part of the reason that I put those 4 faces on the cover of the book, 3 of them are the host ladies we lived with, and the 4th is Farmer Wang in China, is that as we're talking about policies, let's keep in mind that there are people like these, and they each have their own stories. And in 10 minutes, I'm not going to have the time to tell their stories, but what I want to do is to relate it to some of the issues that have come up. So what's the purpose of all of this? What is a good job for development? Raises the question of what is development? And what development is, to me, is the process of improving the lives of poor people like these so that they can attain higher material standards of living. And in order to, that's the process of economic development. Of course, there are non-economic aspects of development, and the report talks a fair amount about some of those aspects as well. Now, Martin, you gave what to me is an impossible challenge. You said you wanted to move away from the labor economics perspective to the development economics perspective, and I'm sorry, I embody them both. And I know I'm schizophrenic, but I'm not that schizophrenic. And so I would like to borrow Bentley McLeod's line, labor economists are simple-minded people. And I think that we do have in mind fairly straightforward methods of analysis and also fairly straightforward objectives. And so I'm going to be crystal clear about what mine is. You can agree with it, you can disagree with it, but I'll tell you what it is. Is that, to me, the single biggest problem in the world, from an economic point of view, is that 3 billion people in the world live on less than $2.50 per person per day, adjusted for what money will buy. Of those 3 billion people in the world, there are 200 million who are unemployed, and many of them are not poor. In fact, unemployment is disproportionately a rich country problem and not a poor country problem, because people like these cannot afford to be unemployed for very long because they need to earn money, and they need to earn money fast, and they will do it somehow. And the ILO statistics would count people who are working even for a short period of time and earning very little, count them as being employed. So the world has 200 million unemployed people in it. The world has 900 million working poor, people who, by ILO standards, earn so little that despite what is typically very long work hours, they are working hard and they are working poor. They are not earning enough money to be able to raise themselves and their families above a $2 a day living standard. And so the question then is, from the point of view of policy, of the many things that we've talked about in this conference and that the report talks about and everything, what do we focus on? Susan Collins said this morning, the way you frame the problem matters a lot. That's right. It does matter a lot. I agree with you completely. And I think the way to frame the problem is what can be done to raise the material standards of living of poor workers in the world like these. So what does that mean? Jesko, there you are. You raised the question a few minutes ago about spillovers and everything. Some of these spillovers are externalities, but one that you included in your list was reducing poverty. And so, of course, that has externalities, but it also is a goal in and of itself. And that's the one I focus on. Sam said, what welfare function? Okay, that's Gary's welfare function. So if we want to reduce that poverty to the utmost, what can we do? Of course, we can intervene in labor markets. We can intervene outside of labor markets. And just to be clear, when I'm talking about labor markets, I mean the place where labor services are bought and sold. Some labor services are bought by employers and sold by employees. But the poorer the country, the larger the proportion of people who sell their labor services to themselves in their own small businesses or their own family farms, household enterprises, and the like. And so to try to raise the returns that people get for the work they do then is the fundamental challenge. Okay, so how to do that, what to do, I should say, flows from the idea that we need to decide on not only an objective, but also on a mode of analysis. Okay, where do we draw the line? I don't like, by the way, the idea of a non-job, saying I'm working, but because my job involves the worst forms of child labor, it's not a job. I don't like that term. I mean, we can say it's not a decent job, but it's a job. That's what some people do for a living. Where do we draw the line? I would draw the line at there are some jobs where I personally would rather that people not work at all than be working in certain types of work. Okay? Slavery, indentured servitude, the worst forms of child labor, bonded labor. We all know what they are. And that would be where I would draw the line. If we had a world that was nice enough to say, oh, well, you would like to work, we will happily provide you with a job, and all you have to do is show up at a National Rural Employment Guarantee worksite, and there will be a job for you if you show up today. If we had a world like that, then maybe I would be, I would feel differently. But most people, if they don't have some kind of job available to them, are simply going to end up with no income, and they're going to be economically miserable, and I don't want that. So that would be where I would draw the line in terms of acceptability. Segmented labor markets. I had that on my list. We just heard from Simon 5 minutes ago about that. And indeed, the idea that labor markets are segmented, that for any given individual, there's such a thing as a good job and a bad job. People would like the good jobs. They are capable of performing the good jobs, but there aren't enough good jobs for all who are capable of doing it. This, to me, is so fundamental a part of our analysis that not to analyze labor markets that way, I think, would be a serious mistake. So how do we intervene? Well, many possible interventions aimed at trying to raise people's earnings and thereby deal with the material standards of living they face. Achieving economic growth, but economic growth of a type that is targeted on low earners, targeted on people like these. Not all economic growth is targeted on that. All we have to do is watch the presidential debates in the United States to realize that. And economic growth for whom is a fundamentally important policy question. And I wish the report had been a little bit more focused in that regard, because the report has so many ideas and so many objectives that it's hard to discern what exactly the report would call for as a priority, and I'll return to that in a moment. Making a country conducive, attractive, to the private sector. So the workers of South Africa or India or Mexico or China desperately need the private sector in their countries to help create jobs for them. And the private sector doesn't need the workers in South Africa or Mexico. It does need the workers of China or some of the, or India, simply because there are so many of them. Increasing wage employment is fundamental, and government can do that. And I think Joe Stiglitz was right to say that it's important to. And I disagree. It's the same point that Joe did on that, which is to say that yes, there is a very important role for the government as an employer. And my favorite example of what can work well and also not work well is India's National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. It works well in the sense that it reaches an awful lot of people in rural areas of a predominantly rural country throughout the country, and it is an employment guarantee. And that's the good news. The bad news is the corruption on the ground. And we all understand that it's there, and the government of India is trying to do something about it, and lots of others are trying to do something about it. But the idea that we should just say, oh, government can't create jobs is, I think, absolutely wrong. But most importantly, I think, as a focal point, is raising the returns to self-employment. And that is that there are lots of ways, many of them may be quite low cost, of overcoming the constraints that self-employed people face. A 30-second story about the woman on the left. This is Angela, who makes fireworks in Mexico. And Angela buys the fireworks powder in small quantities at high unit prices. And she borrows money from a group called Compartamos, which, if you speak Spanish, you realize the irony. It means let us share. And the idea that what you share in is 100% a year interest rates when you borrow money is a great irony. If Angela could access money the way that people in the state of Andhra Pradesh in India can, at the interest rate of 12% a year, not 100% a year, interest that is subsidized by the government, so that if people repay on time, the government in that state pays 9 of the 12 percentage points to the banks, and means the borrowers pay net 3%. This would help her enormously, in part because she could buy the fireworks powder in large quantities, and she could make more money manufacturing and selling fireworks. But in addition, she could also sell the fireworks powder that she now buys in bulk at low quantity, at low price, to other fireworks makers and make money on the sale of fireworks powder. And that would be a way in which she might be able to work her way out of poverty. Now, what I think we need is priorities, as I mentioned before, and we need a criterion. And here's my criterion, and this is my final point. My criterion for deciding what to do would be to ask the question which you have asked explicitly in the report, which is, but not quite in these words, what are, in my words, the marginal social benefits of various interventions that might be thought of, and what are the marginal social costs of those interventions, and where is the difference between the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost largest? And my guess is some interventions like employment guarantee acts and microcredit provided at reasonable interest rates to raise the earnings of the self-employed, and a few other things. Look at their faces, read their stories, understand their problems, not necessarily these people, but people you know and have lived with and understand. And what is constraining them from earning more, and what could be done to help improve their livelihoods, and what would be the most cost-effective way to do it? The answers, of course, differ from place to place. But the questions are probably the same every place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I could invite our own Professor Kiki Pop-Eleches to join us next.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to repeat again also how much I enjoyed reading the report. Now, I have to admit that when I got the report, I didn't look at the references at the end. But the first thing that I was interested in reading is to look at the coverage of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And part of the reason why I was so interested in it is because I think it's one of the boldest social program that has been implemented in the last 10 years, both through its coverage and size. And I think right now, as the report is making clear, it's the biggest public works program in the world. Now, I'm sure that most of you know about the program, so let me just quickly repeat some of its basics. But it's basically was launched in 2006. It was expanded gradually, and it guaranteed 100 days of employment or unemployment allowance for each household in India per year, at a minimum wage of about $2.2 per day in 2009 prices. And it's a really big program. In 2010, about 55 million households were employed, on average of 47 person days of work. Now, it's also a big program from the point of view of public finances. About 0.5% of India's GDP is being spent on it, right? So it is sort of your typical public works program that is used for local rural development projects, things like flood control or road construction or water conservation and so forth. And I think the report is doing a really good job at trying to go through many of the criticisms that have been addressed about the program. And I think that Gary has mentioned a lot of them, so that's the disadvantage of going last in your session. We know that the program has had lots of issues with corruption. There are lots of issues raised about deficit financing as a source of the funding, about poor implementation, and so forth. But what was sort of surprising to me as an empirical development economist who actually doesn't really work on labor issues, but mostly on health and education issues, was that there was surprisingly to me little evidence on what the impact of this program has on things like poverty reduction, employment levels, the wage level, non-labor market effects, and so forth. And my reading of this is that I would probably want to wait. I would want to sort of see more of the potential benefits studied in research before we could sort of make final decisions on how important these programs could be. And this basically brings me to sort of my next point and also my final point. And one of the really amazing things about reading this report, it was that there were so many ideas in it, and I kept coming back thinking about why there's not more work by labor and development economists on these topics. And so what I did a couple of days ago is I looked at the 4 volumes of the Handbook of Labor Economics that was edited in 1999, and it's sort of surprising. There are 2 things that are very surprising in it. There are 2 chapters in it that deal with developing countries. One was written by Jerry Berman on labor market in developing countries, and one was written by Owen Yan on labor markets in Eastern Europe. Together, they covered about 85% of the world population. Now, what is also clear is that all the other chapters in the four volumes were dealing with issues which were mostly related to the Western world. So let me just quote from Jerry here. He says, almost all of the other chapters are concerned with generic and fairly narrowly focused topics in labor economics analysis, generally based on labor markets in the United States, Canada, and a few Western European countries, and very few non-European economies. Right? So my guess is there's sort of two ways that you could read this evidence. One evidence, which maybe is in line with the view that labor economists are simple-minded people, is that we can just say that the pattern should hold across other countries. Maybe the basic analysis from Western countries would hold more broadly. Now, maybe there's another view of the world, and that is that the application depends a lot on the specific institution that we are examining, and that these institutions are probably extremely diverse across different countries. So now, I don't want to say that since 1999 things have not improved a lot, but what was also surprising is that last night I was looking through sort of graduate syllabi at top world universities, and I was looking at graduate labor courses and graduate development courses, and it was really surprising to me how small the sections on labor and development are, especially in the labor classes. And, you know, being an empirical person, I just don't think that the lack of data can be the only excuse. And I think the report made it so clear that there is now a lot of amazing data that's becoming available, whether these are the household surveys or the enterprise surveys or some of the employee data sets that are becoming available. So anyway, I sort of believe that these issues of labor and jobs in developing countries must present just an amazing new opportunity for research, and I sort of hope that a lot of our students will sort of delve with these topics. And this is one thing that I think this report made very clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, if I could now invite Dr. Woergoetter from the OECD.
Okay.
Would you like to come up here?
Do you
stay?
mind if I just stay here?
Wherever you're comfortable, please.
Yeah, okay. No, there are several reasons for that. One is that it's the end of a really very energy consuming because so rich day. So I'm just a little bit tired. So I feel a bit more comfortable in sitting. Then the other issue is that my presentation has evolved a little bit over this day, so it's not it would not be appropriate to use what I have sent actually anyway yesterday after my So what I and then no, I don't want to use this because my experience is when I am using PowerPoint presentations, then people don't pay attention to what I am saying anymore. so that's yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, I'm extremely privileged to have had the opportunity to be around and to listen to all what has been said already, which is really a lot. Maybe what I would want to start with is. Well, I will allow myself to be maybe a little bit more provocative than what you usually expect from someone that you invite to. Yeah. I mean, the first thing is if we look at the title page of your book, yeah, Working Poor.
Working hard, working poor.
Working hard, working poor, and we look on the photo on page, what is that? I think 91. Page 91. Yeah. So what we see there we see the working hard and happy laborer. I mean, it sort of reminded me a little bit about the Biedermeier paintings of the early 19th century and the sort of the poor but clean families that enjoy an apple for Christmas. Yeah. I think there is a little bit of a danger that we are getting into that this jobs, good jobs for development is a bit getting into this into this corner, which would be unfortunate. So I think there is sort of a balance that needs to be respected, and. Especially, I think we need to be careful here also in terms of how we, in advance, define a good job. I mean, let's say, if things don't turn out the way that we expect, will we then just turn around, okay, the jobs that have been involved have not been good ones, and therefore we cannot expect all the development hopes that policy was assuming to happen. I mean, what I'm referring to is there a possibility that let's say Popper's falsification theorem is just circumvented. Yeah, I would think that that's not trivial. Second thing I would like to say, I would like to congratulate SIPA, of course, for its bright future, because, I mean, if we have something that, and I reread the sentence about what is a good job for development, so jobs that contribute to these broader goals. What are the broader goals? Acquiring skills, empowering women, stabilizing post-conflict societies, and then I think there was also something like improving the environment or something of that sort. I mean, achieving all that, yeah? I mean, just think about the skills of the policymaker and the skills of the advisors for the policymakers that are necessary in order to achieve all these goals and to be able to draft the framework legislation that you need in order to make sure that these good jobs for development are flourishing. And I say that against also the background of what I observe both in terms of policy failures in developing and in developed countries. I mean, when we look at policies, don't we have to say that, I mean, what is the usual case is the policy failure and not the policy success? Maybe a trivial example, Germany. I mean, Germany, one of the most praised examples of policy success in the past 10 years. Germany has recently, the German government is about, it hasn't, yeah, is about to abolish banning intercity bus networks. So Germany is a civilized country, yeah, but you cannot open a business operating buses, let's say, between Frankfurt and Hamburg, or between Munich and Stuttgart. And so this is a regulation that has been in place in Germany for about 80 years now. So I think we have to keep in mind that we are dealing with policymakers that are capable of doing or of supporting stupid regulation for very, very long time. So I think we need many generations of graduates from SIPA in order to overcome this obstacle. Okay, so I mean, I guess there would be no one who would say we would not like to have more good jobs for development. I mean, especially after this definition, I mean, who would say anything against empowering women, improving the environment, eliminating poverty, and acquiring skills? Yeah, okay. Then, I mean, the question is to those jobs, and this has been asked already several times in the course of the day, do bad jobs make sense? Let's say when coming here, I had the feeling that actually a lot of jobs in New York are really, really pretty bad jobs. I mean, is garbage collection, is this a good job? A good job for your personal development? I mean, it is a necessary job, yeah? So there are bad jobs from that point of view. You don't acquire any skills. You will not empower any woman, etc. But sort of that type of jobs is necessary. And I'm not sure whether we can really get rid of this problem in this two-sector, in this dual labor market problem. But these jobs seem to be integrated in a normal, let's say, functioning of an economy that, like the U.S. economy, which sorry. by the way, is a benchmark economy for not only for developing economies but also for the developed world. So, well, even let's say with 500 pages, you don't need to deal with everything. So you are dealing with the good jobs. There is still something to be done for labor economists and for other ones. Now there was also, I think, in the morning there was also some reference to the question of one-size-fits-all debate. It's, I think, clear the World Development Report is kind of taking the position there is no one-size-fits-all. I'm not so 100% sure, because, let's say, if we look at what is needed for development, let's forget about the jobs for a moment. I mean, what is needed for development? And I'm here referring to another World Bank study. This is the Spence report that was, I think, published several years ago. Okay, there, what is needed for development is investment and savings. A good education system, the ability to absorb technical progress and to introduce new technologies, and let's say an efficient government that is providing basic government services and takes care of the infrastructure. Now, if we have all that, and let's say if we also, on top of this, get wage determination right, in the sense that we don't, let's say, massively price out workers from employment, I mean, can't we then just assume that a combination of entrepreneurial spirits and individual self-interest and sort of, also good matching abilities by employment offices, etc., will make sure that more or less everyone is having a chance for a good job in a developing. And again, question was, what is a developing economy? For me, a developing economy is one that grows more rapidly than the developed economies. And in growing, I already include sort of well-being aspects. So GDP, an important aspect, but not the only aspect. And from that point of view, I think there is still some one-size-fits-all element, how to make sure that good jobs for development are provided and are, let's say, a growing not only vision, but a growing opportunity for a larger and larger share of the labor force in a country. There is, of course, let's say, a but to the one-size-fits-all, and that refers to, by the way, thanks a lot for providing this 50 megabyte heavy version, electronic version of the World Development Report, because this allows instant searches for whatever kind of term you can be thinking about. And Joe Stiglitz didn't find efficiency wages. True. I think, Sol, you were not finding social. Yes, but there is non-profit, which is coming a bit close. So you see the. No, you don't call. You mean social enterprise is one for profit? Yeah. What then? Okay, so what then is the social thing about it? Okay, maybe we discuss that bilaterally. With what I want to conclude is 4 case studies. 4 countries that I have worked on, with one exception, with which I will begin to make things easier. By the time I have finished, then you may have forgotten the rubbishes that I have spoken about this first country. This is the US first country, So this is, as a headline for this slide that is visible for me only, I used the title, the US, the past, diverging leader. I mean, what is special about the US is that in the 100 years between 1900 and 2000, the US was not converging in the sense of growing less than the rest of, at a lower pace than the rest of the world, but the US was growing faster than the rest of the world. So the difference between living standards in the US and the rest of the world increased. And this is an anomaly. Yeah? So this is something that one would have to explain how that happens. And yes, maybe this also had something to do that the US was able to provide a combination of policies that allowed the supply of, by and large, I would say the largest number of good jobs within one country. And how would that happen? I mean, one thing, and maybe that could also in the report could have been emphasized a bit more. What helps creating good jobs is low entry barriers on product markets. So I mean, if you don't have this bus network regulation business, then let's say it is possible that an innovator is coming and is entering into a market and providing a better product at lower costs, which both favors consumers but may also have the opportunity of providing actually high-income job opportunities. Maybe not really bus driving was my best example in this respect, but anyway, then the second aspect for the US is I think that any innovator had an immediately large internal market available because access to markets was free. Yeah? And innovation was of a sort that it could be the associated rents would be accrued immediately by the innovator. Yeah? And education focuses on general education and not on vocational education. Yeah? I think that's an important aspect of the US model. And finally, endowment universities provide a broad access to higher education. So because I have spoken already too long, I will only sort of offer you one contrasting case study on Germany. So Germany is an example where innovation is actually not supporting structural change, but structural stability. Now, what is Germany doing differently? Germany is putting an emphasis on vocational training. Half of a cohort is going to vocational schools or is participating in dual vocational education, so in the famous apprenticeship system. Employment protection legislation in Germany, contrary to the US, is strict. So it is both cumbersome and costly for a company to fire workers. The third thing is that innovation support is more or less exclusively grants-based, so it is not based on, let's say, on tax advantages. But if you have an innovation spending in mind, then you have to set up an application to an institution, and if you are lucky, then you get some money in exchange for that. And financing is based on relationship banking. So you have your so-called house bank. And all that means that in Germany, existing companies and existing employers are favored and form a reinforcing circle that continuously improves productivity and in that way makes sure that the existing structure in Germany that you could describe as machine producing and car manufacturing, that it stays competitive, which is another anomaly in the world of economies, Because as you mentioned in the report, usually in developed economies, manufacturing is declining, both in terms of share of GDP and also share of employment. And in Germany, not only that is not the case, but the productivity difference between manufacturing and services is increasing. So there is no size fits all, but I would think that that we can, by applying sort of standard economic reasoning, we can achieve sort of some also analytical rigor in with respect to good jobs for development. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think we've heard 4 really fascinating interventions. I've been asking myself as I've heard these whether there were any generalizable conclusions that one could draw from them, and I must say that I think it's very difficult to draw some generalizable conclusions from these different comments. I mean, we've heard some very country-specific and development level specific observations. Clearly the role of the government is a key actor, whether in facilitating the transition or in offering technical vocational support or so on. And I think we've heard different comments, but I'd like to invite each to offer one more minute on the question that started us as to what are the analytics that are associated with the question of good jobs that you would want to emphasize. Is it a useful analytical framework for assessing the jobs that are being created, or really for designing the policies that might be introduced? So if I could just invite each of you to offer from your own experiences the extent to which you think that framework is helpful, either in the design or in the assessment.
It's actually rather a tough question. I mean, I didn't expect to be asked this at 20 to 5 when I was looking forward to a drink. It's outrageous. I had to work. I thought I had a good job. No, but seriously, I sort of find the idea of thinking about a good job makes quite a lot of sense if I think about a sort of rich OECD economy where I know roughly what the earnings distribution is like, I know roughly what people's productivity looks like, I know roughly what their conditions of work and remuneration, wage and non-wage are. And especially if those societies have a lot of redistribution going on, whether through the tax system or social insurance, which, as I mentioned in what I was saying, requires some sort of social solidarity underlying it, then I think this is an absolutely key issue. So, for me, for instance, the fact that the UK generates, at the present time, such a high proportion, relatively high proportion, of bad jobs, low-wage jobs, which are associated with relatively low satisfaction, the subjective element, and relatively low job security, that seems to me problematical. Now, if I switch to a much poorer country and I ask the same question, then I think one has to parse it very differently, because there I think, on simple welfare grounds, maybe the trade-off between being employed and not being employed maybe dominates the sort of good, bad job aspect. So it's not a very precise question, but I think actually, to sum it up, I think the good job idea is really actually an OECD idea. I think it has much less relevance in many of the developing countries with which this kind of conference is actually mainly concerned.
Thank you very much. You're obviously more than up to the question at this late hour, and I thank you for engaging it. Could I invite you, please?
It's part of my cultural heritage to answer a question with a question. And so when you ask what analytics for good jobs, I would answer by asking, in what respect do we want jobs to be defined as good or not? And I would ask a second question is good or not for whom? And I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much.
I would probably like to reiterate something that Gary raised. I think good jobs could be jobs that reduce poverty. I think that's a dimension that we might want to keep in mind for a good part of the world.
Thank you.
Well, again, I look at this question from a policy point of view. And I think for the policymaker, the good job now for development should be maintained as an ambition. I mean, every policymaker should be confronted with the question, are you doing enough in order to create good jobs for development? And then there should be no excuse. And therefore, I think this is a great volume, and a volume that will enhance the policy debate a lot. And that should be a challenge for policymakers in developing and in developed countries. So from that point of view, I think it is, I would go farther than maybe Simon would. However, having said so, I find it extremely difficult to sort of operationalize. Now, if we leave aside the evident, I mean, of course, there is work regulation, health and safety, no one should be discriminated, and this whole catalog, that has to be respected. But beyond that, I'm not sure the concept is operational sufficiently to be sort of put in, let's say, in concrete policy proposal terms. I think as an ex post ambition and benchmark, the concept is indispensable. Right? There has to be this ambition that the policymaker is doing everything that fosters and facilitates good jobs. But what that then means concretely, I'm not sure whether we need to formulate that in good jobs terms.
Okay, thank you very much. May I invite our distinguished audience to ask questions?
I'm Alice Labrie. I'm former U.S. Department of State Foreign Service, served under Richard Holbrooke at the U.S. mission to the UN. And I want to say very quickly about good jobs and bad jobs. I was in the hall to get a document from SEPA, and a young man assisted me. And he said, we were talking where I was today, and he said, well, you know, I was a nanny for 2 years, and now here I am an administrative assistant as a temp. So I feel that there's no such thing as a good job or a bad job. You either have a job or you don't. And success is being able to pay your rent so that you stay out of poverty. So my last comment is, if I hear the word good and bad job one more time, or if I hear a job described as menial, I'm going to call Occupy Wall Street and send them in here.
Okay, well, I think that was a comment, not a question. So perhaps we'll invite others to make questions, if you wouldn't mind. And thank you for that comment.
I have a question for you. When you said one size fits all, what were you referring to? Because it seems to me that much of what the report tried to do was to come up with a typology. And I've been a little bit critical of that, well, critical in a constructive sense of that typology, in saying it is important to have a typology that distinguishes agrarian economies from conflict-affected economies, from urbanized economies, and so on. But at the same time, should there not be an additional, at least one additional lens that within each one of these categories takes into account the initial conditions in terms of initial poverty rate, initial income distribution, wealth distribution, and so on, So maybe I misunderstood the question that you were raising, but if I did so, please correct me. But clearly, the intent, I think, on the part of the WDR was to start to come up with a typology that would make it possible to at least start saying something about the desirable characteristics of jobs that could contribute to development within the context of the characteristics of these different categories.
Well, I think, all of our panelists have addressed this in some fashion, each emphasizing different elements. Could I invite all of you to comment briefly?
Should we start from
We'll start on that.
Okay, so I'm supposed to start? Well, a tough question, of course. I mean, what I was getting a little bit at was no matter which typology, yeah, let's say having savings, investment, rule of law, government that is responsible and provides the services that is supposed to provide, infrastructure that contributes to or reduces transaction costs. And finally, at the end of all that, participation in international division of labor, yeah, and all. I mean, of course, much more complicated than this trivializing textbook reasoning is suggesting. But nevertheless, I think this can be applied to conflict-stricken societies in the same way as. So from that point of view, I may be a bit simple-minded, have a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach in mind, which may mean something different in every different historical context, but in terms of, let's say, building blocks, it always boils down to the same issues.
So I quite enjoyed the typology part. I guess the one point I tried to make that in the concept of an agrarian economy with a lot of rural poverty, maybe it would be nice to keep open sort of public programs as a way to fight poverty, but this would probably work in some places but not in others.
My feeling is that that the report was very helpful. This page that had this decision tree on it that says, is there an engagement strategy, then and offset constraints, remove constraints, no intervention is needed. I thought it was both helpful, but at the same time, it didn't go far enough. And so what I would like to see as a kind of answer to your question, Eric, is so couple that with, so there are many constraints and there are many possible interventions and engagement strategies and these kinds of things. And which one to do? Again, it comes back to what I said before, that it is, so what is the objective? What are you trying to achieve? And what is, from a social cost benefit point of view, the best way of achieving that? If those questions are answered, of course they will, or are asked, excuse me, then of course there will be different answers in different places. And that the report is very helpful in pointing that out and putting a typology onto it.
Well, very briefly, I think the diagram that Gary is referring to, I mean, I found it quite useful, but obviously it's very stylized, is essentially what are the constraints, can you address them, can you not, and sort of it leads you in, out, depending on what the answer to it is. So it's a simple decision tree. And I think it just reminded me that a great deal of what you would get out of a framework like that, or even something more complex, is going to be quite country-specific and institution-specific. So that's why, in a way, when I was saying, I was trying to recuperate or recombine what tends to be common across a great deal of countries. And that, in my view, tends to be that the large, often public sectors, or certainly privileged sectors, sometimes privately owned or and the like, and that if good jobs are indeed one of the objectives that you're after, partly for poverty, partly for distributional and other reasons, then somehow or the other you have to try and address this bifurcation in the economy. And that seemed to be the common theme. Otherwise, I think you end up actually being very country-specific or, to some extent, even region-specific. But
Thank you very much. Well, you know, we just have a couple of moments left, and I wonder if we might, in fact, invite the team, the report team, to offer a final comment on the extent to which you think this good jobs framework, you know, has produced useful analytics and how it fits with the decent work issues that have dominated much of the debates around it.
Thank you for a very constructive and rich session, which I think at the same time highlighted what we have been struggling with for a year since we started. I very much liked Cristian's starting point, which is to say, well, we are dealing with something that in the profession in economics is a bit of an empty space. Take Labor Economics Handbook, 4 volumes, 2 articles that deal with developing countries. And what I felt the panel was doing most of the time is what our starting point was, which is how is the profession trying to fill this void? And let me caricature, let me do a bit as you did with our approach by trying to highlight some points. And if I had to caricature, I would say the way this void is being filled by the profession is a single model, a single objective, a single response. A single model is the partial equilibrium model of the labor market. That is sometimes overstretched. Intellectually can be very stimulating, but one wonders, well, is this really a labor market when Gary says, oh, the self-employed and farmers are in a labor market, well, they sell labor services to themselves. You say, well, that's an abstract way of representing the problem, but does it really tell me where the problem is? Or when Simon says, well, it's always a dual labor market that we're dealing with, and it's true. I don't think anyone can look at a market and not find imperfections, but the question is that where the biggest imperfection or failure that is preventing job creation is? And with this single model, we had this problem, again, that a vast majority of people in the poorest countries are not in a labor market unless one defines it in a very creative way. And some of the biggest problems, some will say, well, slums are a proof of working labor markets and non-working land markets, for instance. And I'm not blaming markets, institutional failures of different sorts. So we were struggling, is this single model really what will take us there? Then there's the issue of the single objective, which I think, again, Gary illustrated well by saying it is the Gary Field's objective function, which is let's reduce poverty, which again, if you take a public economics perspective, is like the objective is I put weight on the utility function of people below the poverty line, no weight above that. And we know that in development there are also other objectives, and as you move more into middle income country or into conflict affected societies, some of the objectives that the things people may be attaching value to are not necessarily or not only poverty. Just emerging from conflict can be an objective. So again, we felt a lack of satisfaction. And the single prescription, again, there were things that were said we will not disagree at all with, like Andreas saying there are some fundamentals. Well, that's the basis of our pyramid. Don't forget the fundamentals, they are a necessary condition. But some of the others were like, well, Enrega, for instance, the public works program. Sure, that's a very interesting model of policy, but if I think of a resource-rich country facing the problem of real exchange rate appreciation and rents, will I say, is a public works program really the silver bullet in that case? Or Simon saying is individual savings accounts for unemployment. Again, it's interesting, but even in the global crisis, very few people in developing countries actually benefited even from unemployment insurance. So the individual savings account is really a hypothetical thing at the margin, as Austria has had. So again, this is something that, well, yes, maybe that's the response. Or Gary said the goal is to make self-employment productive, and that's maybe true, but not necessarily in aging societies where there may be other objectives, keeping activity rates high. So in a way, I think you summarized it extremely well, what we have been facing for a year, which is that way we have as a profession to try to fill that void that Cristian was referring to, which is this single, simple model with a single objective and a relatively silver bullet prescription. Now, did we succeed in filling that void? My suspicion is not, because after your interventions, it's very clear that we did not influence the way of thinking. I think the way of thinking has been very much in the discussion about good jobs, again, from an individual perspective. Thinking good jobs is, I have high benefits and high protection and a motivating job, which is not what good jobs for development when we proposed this approach was, which is what are the jobs that have the highest payoff when measured not through my individual function, but through the social function. Again, we even struggle with this thing. Sweatshop jobs can be good jobs for development if they bring women into paid work, if they help urbanization, and so that's why we thought, well, we have to put a line somewhere at a very low level, which I think we agree with Gary, where the line should be. We will not call jobs slavery or forced labor or exploitative forms of child prostitution. Those are not jobs, but we accept that informal sector jobs can be transformational. What we were saying is, from a development point of view, shall we look at the individual level only or at the aggregate level? Now, as Andreas said, all the conditions that Mike Spence and company identified are in place. If you have a society that is fully urbanized, has gender equality, has high savings rate, high investment rate, strong institutions, is there something you need to do in terms of jobs? No, probably not. But we're not talking about development. Very few developing countries have all these set of characteristics, and you have conflict, you have gender inequality, you have problems of urbanization, and so on and so forth. And what we found is that when you take this perspective, then you realize that some of the most important problems may or may not be in the labor market, and some of the most important responses may or may not be individual savings accounts or public works programs. They may be land policies, they may be fiscal policies, they may be urbanization policies, and so on and so forth. Now, one could say perhaps our failure is that the model was too complex, that the virtue of the way the void is being filled is that it's very easy to understand a dual labor market, and that's where the problem is. Even if that takes your attention to something that may or may not be the central thing. Now, we didn't think that our framework was so complicated. The only thing we did is, instead of taking partial equilibrium, to take general equilibrium. Instead of just taking a world without spillovers, looking at spillovers, environment is just one, and emphasizing get the data, get the story right. So what we propose is just going one step beyond general equilibrium, just accepting that in countries, developing countries where all of these institutions are very partial, governance is incomplete, imperfect, and so on and so forth, jobs can fill some of these gaps, and then to look at the evidence and try to find what the solution is. So I would say, in a way, this was, I hope for others here, a good illustration of what we have been trying to present from a different angle in this report, and also why it has not always easy to convey this different way of thinking. And I would like to hand over to Jesko Henschel for a final word.
Thanks for this, and sorry but we have 2 minutes before this and the beer. So just to follow up on what Martin said, what I'd like to do is, until tomorrow morning, so there's obviously a wonderful evening in between, what would help us, I think, tremendously is if in the panel tomorrow, but then also from you, if you were to help us actually communicate some of these thoughts we have in the report better, because I had the same feeling that Martin, that it was very difficult for us to communicate that concept of good jobs for development, really not from an individual level. So we actually never talk about bad jobs as such in the report, because we have basically what Gary said as the floor, which is pretty much exactly the same floor we have. And then all jobs are good, but additionally to that, some jobs have this social value, which, for example, I was last week in Afghanistan, and very quickly, when thinking about jobs in Afghanistan, we came to conflict. There's about 1 million people in Kabul who are in Kabul because of security problems in the provinces of Afghanistan. So very quickly that discussion went to, well, what are jobs that bring that social fabric, which Martin talked about in the morning, back to society, which give people an identity, which is very difficult to capture in a classical labor market model of a dual economy. In a situation like this, would what be for firms necessary to start operating? We were thinking about safe economic zones, which bring together kind of the classical export processing zone idea with kind of a security dimensions. When we had NASCOM visiting during the WDR in Washington, they were talking about the IT industry in India, and one of the questions we asked was, well, what keeps NASCOM, the IT industry in India, from expanding these type of jobs, which from an individual and probably also from a social value are these good jobs for development? And the answer was functioning secondary cities, because our secondary cities, we cannot get our managers to these because we don't have education, health services, governance is rotten, and we don't have water and sanitation. And we don't have land markets that properly work, and we can't get housing for people. So we can't get actually cities to function, which is one of the really big drivers for development, which we came up with and which we really wanted to emphasize in the report. So if our concept of good jobs for development has that tilt of the social value, what would be very helpful for us tomorrow morning to think with you together how we can communicate that, maybe even with, I'm not sure if we can change the words at this point, it's already printed, but how we frame that discussion, that would be very helpful for us. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been a very, very interesting and rich discussion. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.